Thank you so much. Thank you, Elias, for really setting the tone of this conversation. Even for people who aren't scientists who aren't tracking climate change, I think the terrible weather events of the last 1 year have brought into perspective the fact that this is no longer something we can turn a blind eye to. There was also the UN report on climate change 2021 that painted a fairly grim picture about the role that each of us needs to play in mobilizing support, mobilizing storms, pointed out, and getting our countries and our governments respectively to act upon it. Our specific conversation, though, talking about how Europe and India can partner in climate change mitigation is a really important conversation, given also the fact that we have the COP26 coming up a little later. My first question to my panelists, and I'd like to begin right away to, if I may start with Christopher Beaton. India is now under pressure to declare a zero emission deadline, which India has not done yet. There are some views within India that believes that as a developing country, we shouldn't have to declare a deadline right away. Do you think there is room at all for those arguments anymore? In light of what we know, what the scientists are telling us this year, or do you think that it's now time for all countries to put hands on deck and make the tough decisions that need to be made?
Thanks. I think it's a great question. I think that we need two types of ambition from this year's COP. So one is we need to see kind of evidence-based ambition about trying not to exceed 1.5 degrees. And so I think absolutely there is kind of huge pressure behind all countries to seriously consider whether or not it's feasible for them to set a deadline for net zero. And also to think about what this means in terms of really urgent near-term change. But I think also the other type of ambition we need is socially responsible change. And I think this is kind of what India has taken a stand on internationally and said, you know, we don't want to sign up to a commitment if we're not convinced that we can do it in a way that will protect the most vulnerable and also in terms of its economic impacts kind of won't flow through on negative impacts to other consumers. So I think kind of picking up on Elias's point in his introductory remarks about the importance of effective exchange on know-how. You know, I work for an NGO and I think about collaboration between India and the EU with NGOs. I think a huge part of what we're trying to do is knowledge production. I think we're trying to show that, in fact, you can make these changes in a way which is socially responsible, and then also to kind of share that information with wide ranges of stakeholders to build up their confidence. So I don't think it's my place to say whether this COP is going to be the COP where it's the right choice for India or not, but I think that's where we are, and I think that's the tension. So yeah, you know, very hopeful that we might see statements on this in the next months, but also I think it really relies on this confidence that we can do it in a socially responsible way.
Taking the same question to the rest of the panelists as well, Shikha Bhasin, research on climate change mitigation policies. Ms. Bhasin, do you believe that India is doing enough at this point? And is there enough scientific intelligence that we're picking up or we're learning from the rest of the world in order to be able to maybe leapfrog some of the steps that the other countries took so we can get there a little faster?
So I like how you phrased this question, Faye, especially in terms of can we get there faster? Given where we are today, where climate change has sort of grown from being a serious challenge to a full-blown global emergency, I think India is taking enough amount of sort of responsive steps to make sure that we get there faster than everybody else. And to put that into perspective, the EU, for instance, peaked its emissions back in 1979, and given its 2050 target, it is going to take more than 70 years between its peaking year and to get to net zero. It's the same story for UK, who's the COP presidency this year, and it's a similar story that you're going to see unfolding in the US, in Japan, and all other developed countries. A second thing that we need to think about is what is their per capita emissions profile? And because India has always given a lot of flack for this sort of per capita emissions profile, I also want to add the per capita income amount, right, for each of these countries to be able to get there. Now, if you want to call it a leapfrog, you can, but to me, it seems like a pretty straightforward transition to a decarbonization pathway. India, on the other hand, even if we do decide to be super unambitious, if I can call it that, and say that by the end of the century we'll get to a net zero, we would still be doing it faster than any of these developed economies. So I just want to sort of put this into perspective, given the political narrative that the world is talking about, and how net zero seems to have become the center of attention when we think about climate action. I think we need to be realistic and think about what are the actions that are being front loaded, how much of the responsibility or the promises that were made before have actually been met, whether that's about emissions reduction, it's about technology cooperation, or it's about what's being considered to be climate finance and how much of that has been met. And I'd be happy to sort of delve into all of these aspects more as we go along.
So you did say, of course, that net zero emissions is becoming the focus. There is, of course, the other question of the countries that emit the most carbon dioxide. Are those the countries that we need to be focusing on? In your opinion, which route should the world be taking at this point?
I don't think we're at a point where we should only be focusing on a subset of countries. I don't believe that India is not being ambitious and should not be achieving more as we go along, just as all other countries, because the reality of the world has significantly shifted. But that is also what the Paris Agreement actually allows for countries to do, right? Like commit to what it is that you have committed to, but then please make sure that you get there, because in all of the previous climate agreements that we've had within the UNFCCC, whether it's the Doha Amendment to the Kyoto Protocol or the original Kyoto Protocol, we are so far behind from what was set out to be achieved in terms of just the sheer emissions allowance and where we've got to. And it is a really critical moment politically for us to be able to take stock of what was supposed to have happened by 2020 and where we're at in 2021, and how as a global community of 198 countries do we intend to get there. So are we front loading the commitments that have not been met to make sure that we're getting there? And in the meantime, what is everybody else doing, to get all hands on deck, whether it is in terms of financing solutions, identifying, over the horizon technologies, developing actual collaborative partnerships and not just, civil society engagements. What are we actually doing as states and as non-state actors to get there?
Yes, in fact, and that brings me to my next question, and I'll take this question to Siddharth Singh. For our audience members who don't know, Siddharth wrote a book called The Great Smog of India. It's, the issues that Delhi and many North Indian cities face towards the winter of every year, something that many journalists have spent time and energy on, as have I. And we found ourselves going around in circles and coming back to the fact that our politics stands in the way. We have various parties that refuse to sit down on the state level and have a conversation on how to solve for these problems. Siddharth Singh, there is obviously the international conversations that will take place, the national level or the federal level conversations that will take place, but how important is local government? City level government, state level government in each of these things as well. Will they only pick up their cue from the federal government, or is there a responsibility here on the city level to do more?
Thanks, Faye. I mean, firstly, it's great to be amongst all of you, and I think this is a very timely and important conversation. So I'd like to kind of take a step back first. Before we get to what cities and municipalities should be doing, I'd like to just set the context a little bit better, because I think this problem of air pollution is very local in nature, but it's not. It does not operate in a. It's a function of the technological choices, the policies, and a lot of other things. And I think while air pollution and climate change are distinct problems, there's a significant overlap in how we got here on both fronts. So I'll just very quickly kind of set the context on climate change and come to air pollution. I think it's very important to remember that this climate crisis is not a new problem, and it's also not one that's been created by India primarily, right? But having said that, it does not mean that India should not act and should not be a party to the solutions. And when you act on air pollution, some of our latest studies have shown, when you act on greenhouse gas emissions, it also has an impact on air pollutant levels. So it in a way, it is a you could have a related and I think joint approach to both these problems, right? So what do I mean when I say that climate change is neither a new problem nor one created, by India primarily? So firstly, greenhouse gas emissions don't get reset every year. It's very easy to say that India is the third or the fourth largest emitter in the world, but it's the year itself is an artificial construct. The emissions in the atmosphere have actually been around for decades, if not a century and over. So we need to understand what cumulative emissions mean, and therefore, how the problem, how we got to the stage that we're at currently. Right. Secondly, it's people who pollute, not countries. And of course, countries are formed of people. But the point is that not only today, but even in the year 2040 or the year 2050, the per capita emissions of when an average Indian will be less than the global average. So it's not just today, but also in the future. And I think it's important to therefore remember we need action, at a global level. Also that the carbon intensive pathway is what led the advanced economies to get to where they are. And therefore, you can't fault a country like India for also pursuing one which is very coal intensive, or at least historically has been so. This, of course, is also the reason why India continues to be a high air polluter for our more local and domestic kind of experiences of the environment. But like I said, having said that, it doesn't mean that India should not be a party to the solutions, because firstly, climate change impacts India and Indians, and India is one of the most vulnerable countries, on this front. Importantly, as you kind of brought up, air pollution is a local problem. So while we can blame the whole world and history and everything else for all of those historical emissions on the greenhouse gas emissions front, air pollution is impacting us today and now. And 1 million people dying every single year is honestly very hard to even imagine. The scale of the crisis and the health impacts on the people is indeed unimaginable. And a problem that will feed in onto the air pollution front as well as on the climate change front is where India is headed over the next 20 years or beyond. In fact, one of our latest studies, we estimated that India will be adding the equivalent of 13 Mumbais in terms of population to India's urban population over the next 2 decades. Right? So 13 new Mumbais, and these are Mumbais that are consuming energy, that are polluting, that are buying vehicles, that are building homes. In fact, 60% of the buildings that will exist in the year 2040 have not yet been constructed. So look around you, look at the buildings, and just imagine more than double that will appear in the next 20 years. Similarly, India's vehicle stock is expected to double. So we'll have more cars, more motorcycles. We'll expect a lot more emissions, of course, through all of these activities. Now, at the global front, thanks to the Kyoto protocols and the Paris agreements of the world, we have managed to finally get some momentum going. We have finally managed to get some agreements going across different countries of what needs to be done. I really feel, just like the Paris Agreement, in the case of air pollution in India, we do need an equivalent of something like a Patiala Agreement of sorts, where, like you said, the municipal corporations, the cities, all of us need to bring these stakeholders onto the table, make them talk about what they can achieve on their respective fronts, and therefore, push them to, or rather make it binding for them to achieve it. That's why, the lack of such an agreement across different agencies is the reason why we have this debate every year, where we just end up passing the buck from one institution to the other. And I think it's high time we move beyond that, learn from the international experience, and use that in the Indian context as well.
Bringing in Ludel Bello as well, talking about what we can right now learn from the West, from the EU, and how we can collaborate in order to mitigate climate change. Lou?
Hi, thank you for having me today. So I think I would almost flip the question and say what the non-Western world can teach the Western world, so Europe or the US, in terms of dealing with climate change. These are two different worlds, and I think they start from two different places. For example, the debate that we're touching on before, the net zero. Net zero is a target that sounds really good, and like people can understand it, and it's visually appealing, but also works, or sort of works, for economies that have already peaked their emissions and they're already industrialized. And so the pathway they have to take is just towards that reduction and have to, change their infrastructure and their processes to reduce their emission. And while this can be very challenging, it's a more direct pathway to a certain endpoint. For countries like India or the whole developing world, countries in Africa and elsewhere, it's difficult to even consider the possibility of setting a target like that, because it would be a very abstract concept that doesn't really allow for a series of concrete objectives within, the final goal. So, for example, India has development needs and has sectors that to date emit much more than other sectors. So heavy industries and building construction, Siddharth was mentioning that the country will add 13 new Mumbai's in a short time frame. So all of these new construction and new material will bring a lot of emissions. And so this is a challenge that is very different in nature. And I think why I think it's Europe that should learn from India and other countries is that because the measures that Europe is implementing, dealing with the international community and not just domestically, doesn't really serve the needs of the international community. I'm thinking, for example, the one classic example, the carbon tax that will apply to import, export, and will have an impact on trade, and could affect, for example, exports from India into the EU of materials like steel and other things. India will have to pay more because it has a carbon-intensive manufacturing process, and it's obviously, instead of helping India get rid of its excess emission in these processes, will become a more costly process, and will make it much more difficult to really decarbonize, because it would add financial problems to the decarbonization challenge. So I think it really past time that the Western economies like the EU or the US take a more holistic perspective and recognize that the climate challenge is very different and pans out very differently in various parts of the world. And only then, sitting together at the table, by really recognizing that the starting points are different, although ultimately the end point will be the same, then you'll be able to create policies that have a positive influence everywhere in the world, and not just, serve a developed country view of, where the climate conversation should go.
I also want to ask you, now that I have you, again, for our audience members who don't know, you just won the 2021 winner of the UK Freelance Writing Awards for Science and Health category. Congratulations on that. One of the things we must talk about, because this is Media Rumble, is the way the media deals with climate change, the language that it used. Is it making enough of a dent? Is there something that the media should be doing differently in India and overseas to be able to communicate the level of crisis that we're currently at?
Yeah, this question I think is a great question that every journalist asks themselves and are asked. And I'm not sure there is a clear answer, but what I'm seeing, particularly now that climate is becoming more and more mainstream, is a kind of dichotomy between people teaching more, like journalists and experts teaching more science, which can be a little dry, and journalists teaching solutions. So, for example, electric cars can be the solution to city pollution. And this, I would say, neither of this kind of works, because if you only teach solutions, you fail to grasp the scope of the problem. If it was that easy to electrify everything and solve climate change, we would have done it already. Clearly, it's not that easy. And on the other hand, if you teach the science alone, or you communicate very dry messages, well, people are not going to listen to you. So I think the challenge going forward would be more and more to offer that human dimension to the problem, but also never focusing on that alone. So really, it's an unprecedented effort of literacy where we're teaching our citizens to learn about what climate change is and the basic science of climate change, and what technical knowledge they need to unpack every new story going forward. And climate change, I mean, it's been around obviously for decades and decades, but I do feel it's only now that it's starting to be on the mind of people at an unprecedented scale. Like when I started working on climate change, it was considered a very niche beat, and people were not interested. They didn't even know what it was. Even among my friends and family, they were like, "Oh, this is weird. You do you." Whereas now, it's everyone talks about it. Everyone wants to know about it. So I think it really changes onto this effort of climate literacy that we all have to be part of.
Right. Same question to the other panelists as well, Christopher Beaton, coming back to you on the reporting on climate change, the communication, the language that's used, the sense of urgency that's argued in the pieces that covers climate change as well. Do you think that we ought to be doing more across the world and in India?
Yes. I think there's a lot more that can be done. And I think that's part of the challenge, obviously, because it's almost no matter what you do, there's always more that can be done. I think one thing I'd add to Lou's comment, which I very much agree with, is she talked a lot about literacy. I think also maybe kind of just bringing out voices and representing voices as well. I think that's an area that needs a lot of work. I was participating in a recent webinar from the Global Commission for People-Centered Energy Transition, and a theme that came up there, which I cannot emphasize enough, is I think that people need to be included in the change that's coming. I think when we look at not just the scale of change, but the pace of change that's coming, it's really going to be very big. And I think we've already seen with COVID-19, for example, how these very complicated technical scientific issues really are highly problematic when it comes to kind of interacting with people's everyday lives. I think that particularly with climate change and with energy, there's a lot of engineers who work on energy. People have a very technocratic approach to change. They like predicting how people are going to behave, or mapping out what they think, and often they skip talking to them. Bringing them to around the table, being among the decision makers. I think that there's a lot of really interesting work that's been happening around just transition in Europe, around coal phase outs, which may look very, very different in other parts of the world, but this essential step of kind of bringing out the voices of affected people and including them in change-making processes is something where I think media has a huge role to play. So yes, we can do more, and that would be an area that I'd highlight in particular.
I happen to agree with you, Shika. Bhasin. Is there perhaps a need, especially in India, to be able to communicate the crisis in multiple languages in an accessible way, in a way that doesn't seem to alienate most of the people who need to know about it?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think it's not just the responsibility of media anymore. I think it's really about also civil society, think tanks, like recognizing what role translations can play, recognizing different kinds of communication collaterals almost, right? So if emails are not the way to go, and if like a limited character tweet is not going to get you there, can we come up with cartoons? Can we actually create like video explainers that talk about what net zero is, right? That talk about what the Paris Agreement is? And can this not be translated and sort of like sent on, WhatsApps to everybody, because everybody is hungry for like clickbait today, right? So I think we all need to sort of bridge that gap between science as one part of it, the solutions as another part of it, but really the humanizing aspect of how it's affecting various and millions of faces in India every single day, right? So what is that story of, a farmer in Kerala who has a solar panel on his roof? And what is the story of, a girl who finds her college independence and security in Delhi through an electric scooter, that she can drive around in? I think these are the sort of stories and solutions that we need to look at, but then also recognize the critical role that these technologies are going to play in the the GDP of our country, and give birth to an entirely new set of entrepreneurs? Are we actually being able to communicate all of these as opportunities, to people who may or may not care about climate change, but are definitely getting impacted by it?
Absolutely. And I'm just going to bring in Siddharth to the same thing right now. Like I said, we did talk about the fact that, that many problems are city level, that a lot of the pollution happens on the city level. Is there perhaps a need for city level communication? Because the solutions are also sometimes micro. The solutions are also neighborhood driven, industry or factory driven or agriculture crop driven. Is there a need to break it down to that level? And are we doing enough of that?
No, not at all. I don't think we're doing enough of that at all. I think, one of the first few kind of questions that led me to start researching on air pollution a few years ago was the statistic that I read of, 1 million or so people dying every single year. And my question was that if 1 million people are dying, then where are they? Where are the faces? Where are the stories? Air pollution is an abstract concept. Sure, you can experience it if you were in Delhi towards the end of the year. By the way, on an aside, it's a shame almost that we talk about pollution only in that smog season and not the rest of the year. So there's no time for people to actually drive momentum towards change when you actually need to be working on it, rather than just when the crisis has kind of hit you. But yeah, coming back to the question, I think unless we're able to tell the human stories behind the crisis, it will not resonate with the people. It's not enough to say that PM 2.5 levels or whatever, or I think to most people saying that a 2-degree rise in global temperatures over so many years is a problem. A lot of people don't understand what that means. 2 degrees doesn't seem much because there's much more than a 2-degree variance in the daily temperature on any given day in most places, right? But what does that 2 degrees actually mean to the people, yes, societies? I think that is something that's not been appropriately communicated at a city level or at a level of the neighborhood, like you said, in a way that we can identify with the stories. And I think that's something that we need to work on.
I think, one of the things that I found interesting, specifically because India is such a massively agriculture-driven country, we grow rice in South India, where the stubble doesn't need to be burned. We grow rice again in the north, where the stubble is burned once a year, which causes a tremendous problem of air pollution. So solutions that way also on sustainable agriculture, on whatever industry or crop we're growing, and how it can fit into the larger sustainable growth goals of our country. Is that something that is driven down to federal government, state government, local government? How does that come in?
No, so firstly, it's a pan-India issue in the sense that air pollution in Punjab doesn't just stay in Punjab. It will also, air pollution knows no boundaries, right? So it will flow to the whole northern half of our subcontinent, which is where the problem really is. I think especially when it comes down to the reportage of such issues, we make it seem like it's an urban problem. The problem is not that there's stubble burning in Punjab and Haryana and elsewhere, and that smoke is coming to Delhi. This is impacting rural Indians as much. In fact, 70% of all deaths that happen due to air pollution happen in rural India, right? So we can't ignore that. We cannot ignore the fact that it's a problem that really is affecting every aspect of our society. And I think, therefore, solutions also need to percolate down to that level. If the communication did make it seem them versus us, I think that would be, a major win in terms of how we're able to address the issue. It's not that the farmers who are doing it are doing so because, they derive some sort of pleasure out of it. They have no choice. In fact, there are laws that kind of make it very difficult for them to do it any other way. Just providing subsidies or incentives to stop stubble burning is not enough. You need to take away the incentives that make them do it in the first place. And I think those kind of solutions, while there is a national nature to it, eventually comes down to how local administrations are able to deal with it.
We have a lot of questions coming in from our audience, and I'd like to take those questions. There's a question from Anuj Shiringi, who says, rising sea levels and reports say that 70% of Mumbai will be underwater due to climate change. Is it time to take drastic measures to avoid the inevitable climate change effects, or try to delay it a bit? Just to quickly put some context to it. Now, this was an announcement made by the municipal commissioner of the BMC of Mumbai, Iqbal Chahal, who said 70% of South Mumbai will be underwater because of rising sea levels by 2050. That was specifically the announcement that he made, and he said we must take steps. There was no, sort of clarity on what those steps are. The BMC continues to build the coastal road, though, nevertheless, on the coast that they say will be underwater. But what are these drastic measures that ought to be taken? And is it, like you said, air pollution doesn't stay in a city. Water pollution doesn't stay in the city. Whatever Mumbai is pumping into the ocean doesn't stay at Mumbai. It flows into the entire ocean. At what point is this? It's not just a solution that needs to come from Mumbai. It is a solution that needs to come from perhaps people all over the world. And Siddharth, I'll take that question to you first. But what drastic measures should we be taking?
Look, I mean, the drastic measures will really differ depending on what geography we're looking at. So a drastic measure for India will be very different from a drastic measure that's needed at a global scale. So obviously climate change is a global issue, and you want a drastic measure in the form of, the world's biggest polluters and the world's historic polluters basically saying that they will stop using fossil fuels, perhaps start, a very aggressive phase out of fossil fuels as soon as is possible. But then there's also, for countries like India, who have not historically, polluted as much, but at the same time are impacted, and in the future there's a, grave room for India to actually pollute more. India needs from the West, at least three things, investments, and investments. We need a lot of it. We need to drastically figure out ways to, for example, about 80% of India's power is generated using coal. Is there a way for India to go out there and say that we're going to phase out all coal use in power by the year 2040? It's possible, but we need a lot of money for it. We need a lot of other things. And I think it's doable. And that would be a drastic measure at an India level kind of, in terms of India policy. I'm eager to also listen from, hear from the other panelists what they think an aggressive set of actions could be for India and at the global level.
Actually, I'll just open this up to the entire panel, to anyone who wants to respond to that. Christopher, do you want to take that? What would an aggressive set of measures be on the India level and the global level to mitigate rising sea levels to begin with?
Sure. I mean, maybe we could start with the fact that India, along with all countries around the world, are currently taking very, very drastic measures around the impacts of COVID-19. They're spending huge amounts of money, but is the money being spent in ways which is aligned with the kind of clean energy transition? So a lot of ISD's work over the past 2 years has been promoting a fossil-free recovery. So we've tracked about $336 billion being committed to fossil fuel intensive sectors right now, compared to only $275 billion for clean energy. So I think one thing that could be done is spend the money we're already spending, which is drastic, but in ways that are better aligned with solving some of these long-term problems. That I think brings me to the second point, which is really shifting government support away from fossil fuels and towards clean energy. And actually, I think this is an area where India can already show it's been playing a huge leadership role. So the size of fossil fuel subsidies has fallen very significantly since 2014. And there's been big increases in expenditure on clean energy. That's wavered a little in the past few years. It's partly linked to fossil fuel prices globally as well. But I really think that there is a big case for India to think about what its next generation of support measures are going to be for clean energy. When we take a look at the policies that are in place right now, they're actually fantastic policies, but they've kind of gotten us to where we are now, the one kind of 100 gigawatts which is installed. But where's the kind of the policy platform for getting to 450? I think in this respect, state-owned enterprises are a fascinating topic. They play such a huge role in, particularly in India's energy makeup. They've got really strong commitments to social responsibility and making sure they're contributing towards kind of, just general social good, as well as meeting their kind of profit needs, and a kind of a really strong mandate for them to shift investments towards clean energy would be great as well. In FY 2020, we identified about 3.1 billion USD investment in fossil fuels, which was about 11 times as much as RE. So these are really big players. They've got a really strong sense of social responsibility. It would be fantastic to see them kind of joining in and kind of making bold commitments for energy transition.
There are a couple of questions that have come in from audience members. One question from an anonymous audience member who says, in one of the sessions with school children where the child asked the Prime Minister Modi about climate change, he basically, roughly translated, said that as people get older, they feel colder. And that's really what climate change is. What's your comment on that answer that the Prime Minister gave? And it's linked to a question that Daksh has asked, which he says, your views on ignorance by elected leaders towards climate change, completely dismissing it, not recognizing it as a major issue. Politics does play a massive role, as we saw in the US, where on one hand you had Donald Trump in his term sort of rolling back decisions that were made on climate change, and now we have Joe Biden who's sort of pushing the pedal going forward. So politics does, have an impact on what countries decide to do, whether elected representatives decide to deny or to acknowledge. So two questions there, one on the Prime Minister of India and his statement, and the other on, basically heads of state denying climate change. Christopher, do you want to take that?
I think that one of the things, yes, politics is incredibly important for change. So a lot of the work that we've done over the past 10 years in ISD has been focused on fossil fuel subsidy reform. And I think that we've seen that the problem really is as political as it is technical. So you can put together all the great reasons in the world as to why you should make change happen, but unless you have the buy-in and unless there's a kind of a national level of support for change, it's going to be very difficult to implement it. So I think a lot of what we see from politicians reflects what's happening in terms of the attitudes of national populations. It brings us back to some of the things we've already discussed about the importance of the media in terms of literacy, kind of giving people voices. So I do think that it's very political, and we shouldn't be surprised when politicians say what they need to say in order to speak to their constituencies. With respect to the comment from Prime Minister Modi, I'm not familiar with it, but I think that he takes climate change very seriously from the numerous other statements I've seen from him. So I would assume that it was not intended to be taken as a kind of representative of his overall views.
We have a question from Pavan. It says, private sector produces 50% of the electricity in India. Given the fact that renewables can't be monopolized at the source, what could be the possible incentives for private sector to ensure we have sustainable production? And this is an important question. It's come up in the discussion once as well about India perhaps reducing its dependency on coal. At the end of the day, even if India switches largely to electric vehicles, our electricity is coming from coal, and that's not necessarily the best way. What possible incentives could be offered to the private sector in order to incentivize more clean energy? Shikha, Bhasin, do you want to answer that question?
Sure, thank you. And I think we need to think about it from the point of view of the private sector, right? I mean, are they doing it because their stakeholders and their shareholders are demanding them to be clean companies? Or are they doing it because actually electricity is just becoming more and more expensive for them? And so therefore, moving towards setting up their own renewable energy plants that give power to them, moving towards far more process engineering that is energy efficient in nature and therefore reduces the load of requirement themselves. Is that why they're doing it? Or is it because the customers of their products, have suddenly grown up in India and are wanting and are demanding sustainable products to come out of these, companies or these private sector entities that we're talking about. And I don't think it's going to be either or. I think it is going to take a lot of technology cooperation and collaboration and investments from a range of actors, right? And these are actors who are working in science labs right now, trying to get these technologies ready. The green hydrogen mission, the hydrogen mission that's been announced earlier this year, that's supposed to, there's so many eyes on it, looking to the kinds of investment that will be required for the companies and the private sector entities, which is really hard to abate. The emissions are really hard to abate from these particular sectors. So we're looking to technologies that we know today. We're looking to technologies that we hope to be familiar with, in time to come. But I think it's again about communicating change, communicating climate change, and then demanding it. And I think this goes to air pollution, it goes to products, and will impact the way your political leaders are responding to climate change as an issue, as well as your private sector.
That is very well said, and there's so much that can be done on the individual level, on the household level, on the building society level, on the community level as well, along with corporate and government and city and state. So much to do before we reach any sort of conclusion. But I want to thank the panelists this afternoon for giving us time. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I'm really glad also and grateful to News Laundry and the Media Rumble for including a conversation on climate change. It's really important that climate change now becomes mainstream and be included in all of our discussions. So I'm really glad that we had this opportunity to have this chat. Back to the Media Rumble team.